Morning settles over a ruined German town. The air is cold, damp with smoke that has nowhere left to rise. Brick dust clings to broken streets. Windows are gone. Roofs sag inward. War has already passed through here and taken almost everything with it. From behind a shattered doorway, children watch the road. They are thin, quiet, too old to cry, too young to understand surrender. Their fathers are gone, dead, missing, or prisoners somewhere beyond the horizon. Their mothers barter what little remains. Hunger has become routine. Fear, constant. They have been taught what to expect. Americans, they were told, were cruel, undisciplined, violent, monsters in uniform who would punish, humiliate, destroy. Nazi lessons drilled this certainty into classrooms, youth camps, and air raid shelters alike. Even now, after defeat, the belief lingers. Then the sound arrives, engines measured and steady. U.S. Army trucks roll slowly into town. No shouting, no firing. Soldiers dismount, not rushing, not celebrating. One kneels to light a cigarette. Another unwraps a ration. The smell is unfamiliar: coffee, meat, chocolate. A soldier notices the children watching. He does not raise his voice. He reaches into his pocket. And in that small, unexpected gesture, something carefully taught for years begins to crack. Long before American troops crossed the Rhine, German children had already been drafted into the war, without uniforms, without weapons, and without choice. From the moment Adolf Hitler took power in 1933, the Nazi state moved quickly to reshape childhood itself. Education was no longer about curiosity or growth. It became a tool. Schools were reorganized to serve ideology. Textbooks were rewritten. History lessons were stripped of complexity and replaced with certainty. Germany was strong. Germany was surrounded. Enemies were everywhere. Children learned early that loyalty mattered more than truth. The Hitler Youth and its female counterpart, the League of German Girls, became nearly unavoidable by the late 1930s. Attendance was first encouraged, then expected, and finally compulsory. These organizations did more than organize hikes or sports. They trained children to think in absolutes: friend and enemy, strength and weakness, purity and corruption. American culture, in particular, was portrayed as decadent and inferior. Hollywood films were banned or mocked. Jazz was labeled degenerate. American society was described as undisciplined, racially corrupted, and morally weak. Even before war began, children were taught to laugh at the idea of American seriousness. They were told the United States relied on money, not courage, comfort, not sacrifice. When war erupted in 1939, this narrative hardened. As German armies advanced across Europe, children absorbed the language of victory. Maps in classrooms changed color. Radios broadcast triumph. Newspapers spoke of invincibility. To young minds, the world seemed to confirm what they had been taught. But by 1942, the tone shifted. Air raid sirens interrupted lessons. School days shortened. Teachers disappeared, drafted, killed, or reassigned. Cities darkened under blackout rules. Children began sleeping in basements and shelters, listening to bombs tear through neighborhoods they had known since infancy. Even then, propaganda did not soften. Instead, it intensified. Allied bombers were framed not as military forces, but as criminal terror machines. Leaflets warned of barbaric invaders. Stories circulated, often invented, about American soldiers abusing civilians, stealing food, mocking German suffering. For children, fear and hatred became intertwined. By late 1944, the war reached into classrooms directly. Boys as young as 16 were issued armbands and rifles under the Volkssturm militia. Younger children dug trenches, carried messages, and cleared rubble after air raids. Survival replaced play. Obedience replaced childhood. Yet despite hunger, loss, and exhaustion, the lesson remained constant. The enemy would show no mercy. This belief followed German children into the final months of the war, into ruined towns, refugee columns, and cellars where families waited for the front to arrive. And when it did arrive, it came not with the chaos they had imagined, But with something far more confusing be why the winter of 1944, Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for time. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. In the West, American, British, and Canadian forces pushed steadily after Normandy, breaking through at Saint-Lô, crossing France, and approaching the German border. For civilians, especially children, the war narrowed from a distant idea into an approaching presence. Entire school systems ceased to function. Teachers vanished. Buildings were destroyed or converted into hospitals. Children were evacuated from cities to villages that could barely feed themselves. Others remained behind, moving from cellar to cellar as bombing intensified. Hunger became routine. By early 1945, ration cards provided only a fraction of daily nutritional needs. Children scavenged for scraps. They traded possessions for food. In cities like Cologne, Kassel, and Hamburg, groups of children roamed ruins in search of coal, bread, or anything that could burn. Yet the message drilled into them remained unchanged. Fear the Americans. Propaganda leaflets described U.S. soldiers as crude, undisciplined, and dangerous. American abundance was reframed as corruption, soft men who relied on machines and luxury rather than courage. Even American food was mocked in stories, portrayed as tasteless, artificial, or unfit for Germans. Then the front crossed the Rhine. As U.S. divisions advanced into Western Germany in March 1945, resistance collapsed unevenly. Some towns fought. Many surrendered without a shot. For civilians, the arrival of American troops often happened suddenly. One day German soldiers were present, the next day they were gone. Children watched from windows, doorways, and rubble piles. They expected violence. Instead, they encountered something unexpected: order. American units established checkpoints, not firing squads. Curfews were posted, not mass arrests. Soldiers guarded bakeries and food stores rather than looting them. Trucks rolled in carrying not just ammunition, but supplies. For children, the most striking difference was visible immediately. American soldiers looked well-fed. Their uniforms fit. Their faces were not hollow. They chewed gum. They handed out cigarettes. Their vehicles carried crates marked with food labels unfamiliar to German eyes: canned meat, chocolate, powdered milk. This contradicted everything children had been taught. In some towns, German children laughed openly. They mocked chewing gum. They mimicked American accents. They whispered that this was proof of decadence, that these men were soft, spoiled, unserious. The laughter did not last. Within days, reality asserted itself. American field kitchens produced hot meals while German families starved. U.S. soldiers shared rations with civilians, sometimes officially, sometimes quietly. Children watched as chocolate bars appeared in hands that had not held sweets in years. No punishment followed. Instead, patterns emerged. Soldiers consistently enforced rules but refrained from cruelty. Food distribution was organized. Medical aid followed. Disease outbreaks were addressed. Children, once warned to hide, now stood openly along roadsides. Confusion replaced certainty. For many German children, this was the first moment when propaganda failed completely. The enemy did not behave as promised. Kindness appeared where hatred had been predicted. And this quiet contradiction, played out in streets, farms, and shattered towns, set the stage for a deeper reckoning that went far beyond military defeat. The first angle unfolded quietly at child height. German children had been trained to observe authority closely. Uniforms mattered. Tone mattered. Obedience was survival. For years, they had learned to read power through scarcity. Thin faces, strict discipline, controlled emotion. Hunger and order went together. Suffering was proof of seriousness. The Americans did not fit the pattern. They were loud without being cruel, relaxed without appearing weak. They enforced rules yet smiled while doing it. For children conditioned to associate authority with punishment, this contradiction was destabilizing. It did not feel like liberation. It felt like a mistake that would soon correct itself. Some children laughed. They laughed at chewing gum stretched between teeth, at slang they did not understand, at soldiers who carried candy instead of riding crops. Laughter was a defense, a way to protect certainty in a world where certainty had already begun to crack. But laughter does not survive hunger. The second angle emerged through food. American rations were not abstract symbols of abundance. They were tangible. Chocolate that did not crumble into dust. Bread that did not contain sawdust fillers. Meat that arrived in sealed cans, not rumors. For German children whose bodies had adapted to constant deficit, this was not luxury. It was shock. Food carried meaning beyond calories. It exposed lies. Children had been told Americans were decadent and undisciplined. Yet decadence did not explain logistics. Gum did not explain full stomachs. Chocolate did not explain how entire armies remained supplied while Germany collapsed into scavenging. The lesson was absorbed without discussion. Abundance, they realized, was not accidental. It was organized. This recognition marked a psychological turning point. The war was no longer just lost militarily. It had been lost structurally. The Americans had not simply defeated Germany in battle, they had outproduced it, outfed it, outlasted it. The third angle revealed itself through behavior. American soldiers did not demand gratitude. They did not lecture children. They did not use food as a bargaining chip. Rations were shared without ceremony, often without orders. The absence of conditions was more unsettling than generosity itself. German children were used to exchange. Everything carried obligation. Kindness was transactional. Authority was never free. But here, no debt was demanded. This created discomfort. Children waited for punishment that never arrived. They tested boundaries, watching, whispering, returning day after day. Over time, fear gave way not to trust, but to routine. And routine, more than kindness, reshapes belief. From the children's perspective, the Americans did not conquer emotionally. They normalized. That normalization undermined years of ideological conditioning more effectively than any argument could have. The enemy had been framed as monstrous. Monsters do not share food. Monsters do not enforce rules calmly. Monsters do not remain consistent. Yet consistency was exactly what children observed. This erosion of belief did not happen all at once. It happened through repetition, through the same soldier appearing each morning, through the same ration distribution at the same hour, through the absence of revenge. And as these human moments accumulated, something deeper began to surface, questions not about the enemy, but about what they themselves had been taught to believe. Those questions would soon intersect with broader forces, military planning, occupation policy, and moral consequence, where individual shock became part of a much larger transformation. The fourth angle emerged not from emotion, but from calculation. For American commanders, children were not symbols. They were indicators. In the spring of 1945, occupation planners understood that Germany's defeat had created a vacuum more dangerous than resistance. Hunger destabilized communities faster than ideology ever could. Children wandering streets, begging near checkpoints, scavenging through rubble, these were not humanitarian footnotes. They were warning signs. Malnourished children meant families had collapsed. Collapsed families meant uncontrolled movement. Uncontrolled movement meant disease, black markets, and unrest. From a military perspective, feeding children was not softness. It was containment. U.S. doctrine had evolved during the war. Lessons from Italy, France, and liberated territories had made one fact clear. Stability followed calories. Where food arrived consistently, violence declined. Where children were fed, adults complied. This logic reframed kindness as control. Rations distributed to children reduced pressure on patrols. Medical treatment reduced outbreaks that could cripple occupation units. Schools reopened not for ideology, but for order. Children inside classrooms were children off the streets. In this framework, generosity became infrastructure. The fifth angle revealed itself in moral contrast. German youth had been taught that hardship forged strength, that deprivation purified society, that softness weakened nations. The war had enforced this belief brutally. Hunger was presented as duty, suffering as honor. The Americans shattered that logic without debate. They did not glorify scarcity. They eliminated it where they could. Their soldiers were well-fed not because they lacked discipline, but because their system demanded it. A soldier who eats well fights longer. A nation that feeds its children endures. This was not moral preaching. It was demonstration. German children observed that American authority did not require visible suffering to maintain obedience. Rules were enforced without cruelty. Punishment existed, but it was procedural, not personal. This distinction mattered deeply to young minds shaped by spectacle and fear. Authority no longer appeared mystical. It appeared managerial. And managerial power, unlike ideological power, could be understood. The sixth angle formed where all others intersected, the child as long-term reality. Occupation planners recognized something the Reich had ignored. Wars do not end with adults. They end with children who remember. Children would carry impressions forward, not slogans but experiences, not speeches but patterns. Whether Germany would resist, comply, or rebuild peacefully depended less on courts and more on classrooms, kitchens, and clinics. American kindness toward children was not sentimental. It was anticipatory. A fed child was less likely to radicalize. A treated child was less likely to resent. A normalized childhood disrupted the inheritance of hatred. This did not mean love replaced suspicion. It did not erase trauma, but it interrupted transmission. For German youth, the realization came slowly. The Americans were not trying to humiliate them. They were trying to stabilize them. The difference was subtle but decisive. By late 1945, this shift had become visible. Laughter faded. Curiosity replaced mockery. Children no longer watched soldiers as invaders, but as fixtures, part of the landscape of a changed world. The Americans had not won hearts in a single gesture. They had worn down disbelief through consistency. And as this realization spread, from children to parents, from neighborhoods to institutions, the story approached its turning point. Because when authority is no longer feared, but expected to function, the nature of control itself changes. And that change, quiet, administrative, irreversible, would soon reshape the entire occupation.